Do you think you could speak for a minute? I mean, honestly, this stuff goes way back, and I think
Hmm.
people really want to
Okay.
know. They want to kind of get an
Hmm.
idea of how did this all get started? I mean, here we are with this
Yeah.
group, all this secret government stuff that's going
Mhm.
completely rogue and completely outside of any kind of oversight, right? How in the world did all this get started? What is the history of this? Is it J-12?
Yeah.
What actually is it, and where did this literally get started?
Well, I actually think it began in the late 1800s, and there are still top secret files on the UFO issue from the late 1800s that are not opened. And it really, it was something that was observed. Look, these extraterrestrial vehicles have been observed since the earliest recorded human history. There are cave drawings showing exactly the kind of craft and being creatures, intelligent beings that are seen today from thousands of years ago, from cave era drawings and paintings in India and France and all over the world. So the big issue becomes, since that's something that's not new, it's not like that's a new phenomenon. But my understanding is that some of that was beginning to be observed by intelligence, military, etc., back in the late 1800s, early 20th century. Remember, a couple years ago, we disclosed that photograph of what is a dissection um, of an extraterrestrial body from the 1920s, that a woman who worked at Roswell, and before that, the Manhattan bomb project in New Mexico, had in her belongings that fell out of a book. And that was from the best medical historian who looked at all the equipment and gloves and gear and everything. So this was from the between 1922 and 1930. So, and that was a operation that had military and civilian suits with doctors doing a dissection on this creature. So now that's over 100 years ago, or about 100 years ago now. So we know for a fact that there are archives in the covert government that have information that goes back at least 100 years. Now, I think where it became greatly significant was during and after World War II. And during World War II, there were these objects seen all over. They were called Foo Fighters. Yeah, there's a band called Foo Fighters. That's how they got their names, guys. Dave Grohl knows that that's what these are. It were these strange, luminous, trans-dimensional craft and objects that were flying around our aircraft in World War II. And I love telling the story of a friend of mine, doctor. There's actually a great medical doctor network on the disclosure issue that, or somehow it's just strange because I'm a doctor. They come to me and their family, or they're connected into this program. And Dr. Altshuler, who was a very renowned pathologist and hematologist in Denver, was on our team for years. He's passed away. His uncle was General Jimmy Doolittle. And General Doolittle went over to investigate these weird objects in World War II early 40s, and came back and told President Roosevelt, "Sir, those are interplanetary vehicles." I am quoting. So we know that that was on the radar of military intelligence and White House back even then. And I think the big programs picked up speed once they developed the Tesla related scalar and electromagnetic pulse weapons that could target and stun these uh, interstellar craft that are totally electromagnetic and electronic. And if you can hit them with that kind of a system, they'll fall out of the sky, quote unquote, like a rock. So says a colonel who operated those systems near Eglin Air Force Base along the Gulf Coast some years ago in the 90s. So those programs evolved and way back. I mean, people forget the history of these sort of electromagnetic breakthroughs that began in the 1800s, early 1900s. And Nikola Tesla, genius that he was, um, really had very detailed information on that then got exploited by covert programs way back then. And so that's how we started acquiring the ET vehicles in and after World War II, both in Europe and in the United States. Roswell was by no means the first or the only targeted downing of an extraterrestrial vehicle. So that's how far back it goes. Now, of course, the history of it going forward gets more and more convoluted the more that the military industrial complex, as Eisenhower called it, realized what they had. And when they got the big breakthrough on reverse engineering, studying extraterrestrial technology, propulsion, energy, that's when the lid really came down on it. And they moved it from a constitutionally overseen program to an unsanctioned, illegal program, because the big financial industrial interests realized this comes out and Standard Oil's out of business, Exxon, all the coal and oil and gas in the world is out of business, et cetera, and so on. So I think that it evolved over a period between the late 1800s, early 20th century into the 40s, and then that huge breakthrough from the 40s to 1954, when there were these concerted, highly covert, more secret than the atomic bomb program, projects that were stood up to figure out what these things are, where they come from, and how they operate. But the breakthrough of figuring out how they do operate came with the very powerful interests that are not elected going, shit, excuse my language, but I'm sure they went, oh my God, well, this is the end of our entire industry. This is our entire centralized global economic and energy system of the world. Goodbye. It'll go the way of stagecoaches, right? So I think that was the singular moment when this pivoted from a very covert program, kind of spooky, but very covert and known by the president and certain key people, to being an illegally run program. It was right
Yeah.
in that period between 1954 and 57.
Do you think that Operation Paperclip had a great deal of influence on the development of these anti-gravitics or not?
I think Operation Paperclip, if you read the book, I think there's a book by that name, uh, doesn't mention this issue. There were a whole lot of issues because what we wanted was, and it came that name, by the way, people don't know how, and the names are funny, how they come about. They would put the OSS, which was the predecessor to the CIA, would put a paperclip on a file, a certain paperclip, to indicate that scientist, that person is not going to be hanged at Nuremberg or whatever. They're coming back into the States because they have knowledge that we want. So that did include people like Werner von Braun, right? And Herman Oberth and some of the other people who were read into this and were the foundation of not only our CIA programs, but our covert engineering, rockets and what have you. But the rockets were known, right, by the public. What wasn't known is that this other operation, code word, highly compartmented away from what other people would know, were going on with the help of some of these really brilliant European scientists who they did not want executed and saw them as an asset. And for that reason, they put a system in place to protect those human assets, as they're called, these sort of people that could be valuable.
Wow. So was this about the same time that the defense contractors got involved, like Lockheed Martin and, you know, General
Yeah,
Dynamics, Rand and people, corporations
yeah.
like
Well,
that?
I mean, they've all gone through name changes and
Mhm.
development, but
Okay.
certainly from the 40s to the 60s was the big boom in aerospace engineering, rockets, going to the moon. And so there was a whole complex stood up. Uh, and of course, the most money always goes towards the military end, not the NASA civilian end. And then NASA actually became a proxy for the military and industrial efforts, as opposed to something that was actually an independent operation. It was always highly militarized. The entire Apollo mission, and my uncle worked on the lunar module at Northrop Grumman. was a proxy for the Cold War against the Russians and our race into space. So there's always been a heavily militarized aspect of all that R&D and all those programs. But this issue was the most tightly controlled, most secret, and received enormous funding, black budget funding that the public and most members of the US government didn't know about. But for a while, it was being run legally, at least, where the key people in Congress and the president knew. At this point, that system completely broke down during the reign of Eisenhower. Eisenhower trusted people, I'm told, by people who knew him personally, that they shouldn't have trusted. And those folks circled their wagons and limousines and ended up cutting him out of control of these projects. And of course, we know by the time Jack Kennedy got elected, this is one of the very first things he asked about. And it was quite clear, and I've had this conversation with briefly with Bobby Kennedy Jr. and other people in the Kennedy circle, that the president was absolutely knew about the issue, but he had no control. You remember that the chief steward, as he was called on Air Force One, that we have in our disclosure project collection, had the chat with Jack Kennedy flying over to Germany when he gave the "I am a Berliner" speech, during the whole Cold War standoff in Berlin and the Berlin Wall. And this Air Force officer, we have on record, tape, said that he brought this issue up to Jack Kennedy, the president, because there was a newspaper headline as they were flying over about some huge UFO that was picked up, and it was in the media. And so he and the president started talking about this. And President Kennedy said, "Oh, yes, I know those are real, but the whole matter is out of my hands. And I don't know why. I have no control over it." Now, that's the president speaking directly to one of our witnesses. So now, that's, of course, the guy was so shocked, and he went, "What? This is the president of the United States." And so that would have been in when was that? "I am a Berliner" speech. I think 61 or 2, or, of course, he was killed in 63. And unfortunately, Jack Kennedy shared that information sort of when he was having his affair with Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe was going to hold a press conference to tell the whole world about all this, including the retrieval of the ET spacecraft in New Mexico in the 40s. It's specifically mentioned in this top secret document we have. And the wiretap from that document's wiretap date is like a day or two before they found her dead. And Burl Ives, who was a famous actor and singer, and his wife knew Marilyn Monroe very well, and said, "We all knew she was killed, but we never knew why." So I gave Burl Ives this. Here. He read it. He went, "My God, no wonder she was killed." So that's what happened to Miss Monroe. But so that whole era where they started wanting to stamp out any leaks about this, it really stood up heavy. It was from the 20s, but it went illegal in the 50s. That's the key thing. So there was a period there where it was very, very clandestine, small circle, but legally being looked at. It went off the rails, totally illegal, Black Project, in the 50s. And subsequently, all kinds of nasty things have happened, to whether it's a president or other people who've tried to get to the bottom of it. Obviously, eventually, Jack Kennedy was killed in part over this issue.
So this kind of leads into the history of these extraterrestrials and their involvement or
Yeah.
their contact with government officials going probably way back, and their attempts maybe at disclosure in a friendly manner. So what happened to that, and what is that history really? Because there's so many, as you know, there's so many stories that go on about this.
There are, and here's what there are: stories, and then there are facts that are obtained from people who were there, who had knowledge of it, or we have documents or what have you. So I try to stick with what I can hang my hat on is a fact backed up by a document, government document, or a witness, or what have you. The fact of it is that in the 1954 to 57 period, once we mastered what's called gravity control, right? And remember, the top scientists at the largest Department of Defense lab, the Naval Research Labs in DC, which was started by Thomas Edison, the top scientist in that lab personally was on our team for years, and a friend. He's passed away. He was in the top secret vault and saw the documents, unredacted, of course, that specifically dealt with this issue, where it said we mastered gravity control in October 1954 in the discussion. Now, there's a direct person who saw that. That is the tipping point, because once they've had the technology breakthrough, it was decided by these powerful interests, we can't let the public know anything about this, all right? And it was all shut down and pivoted towards a unsanctioned illegal operation where they increasingly pushed aside the political overseers. Because remember, in our democracy, the people we elect oversee the Pentagon, the CIA, et cetera, whether it's the White House or the Congress. They decided that was too porous and too likely to leak out, and they sealed it. And that was and Eisenhower got betrayed and was cut off. And his widow told a friend of this project from the 90s, who's now passed away, that Eisenhower was heartbroken, furious, depressed, very upset about this. But yes, he actually had met with ETs out in the desert, Muroc, M-U-R-O-C. It's now where Edwards Air Force Base is. And I've been there. I've been over that entire Edwards complex in a chopper at close range over black airspace. But what happened is that the ETs wanted us to stand down these weapons of mass destruction and nuclear and atomic weapons, and would help with us bringing out technologies that would get us off all these environmentally and nuclear damaging ones. And Eisenhower wanted to do that, by the way. But the people around him, the whole machine around him, covert military intel, did not. And that's when it went south, because he was very favorably disposed to doing that. Had that happened about the time I was born in 1955, this would all be a moot point. The issue would have been disclosed, the technologies would have been feathered in over time, we'd be off oil, there'd be no pollution, world poverty would have ended easily by the 1970s, et cetera, and so on. So that singular error that happened in the mid-50s has led to now this situation we're in now.
Right.
Both environmentally, humanitarian, interstellar, et cetera, and so on and so forth. So, once that happened, now the men that I've spoken with who are pretty high up in that system right now, they're sort of accidentally inherited this mess, right?
Right.
Because if you're in your mid 40s to 50s and you're currently in that system, well, you were just not even born in 1970. So by the time you got involved and got pulled up and given a little bit and a little bit more and moved up to the senior system, they got you. And now what do you do? Because look at it, put yourself in their shoes. You're doing this, you're obeying the law, you think you're doing things legally. And next thing you know, you find out you are in a system that's illegal. You're already stuck in it and you're part of it. How do you get out? How do you get a parachute out of that? That's what we're offering some of these people who are currently way up in that system. But it's dangerous for them and us, of course. Anyway.
Are we also offering that maybe to the rank and file under these guys when they become aware that maybe what they're involved with is not actually sanctioned by the legal government? Is that offered also to the rank and file military?
Well, here's how I think, it has to happen. And what's Right now, the amnesty period wasn't put into the bill, right? Um, but there are whistleblower protections legally, and people can provide information legally when outside of their compartmented intelligence system when the program is illegal. What do I mean by that? If the program's illegal, by definition, it doesn't have the cover of law of a top secret clearance. That goes away. This gets me back to why I've told Congressman Burchett in my meetings with him and Luna and others, Moskowitz and the Senate intelligence folks, you don't need a skiff for this because you don't give them the dignity of a sanctioned legal top secret process when the entire operation is illegal, unconstitutional, and a criminal operation. I mean, you don't give the mafia or a crime family the sanction of going into the Senate skiff, secure compartmented information facility, these sealed, electromagnetically sealed meeting spaces that I've been in. You don't give that to the Don in charge of the New Jersey mob, right? To protect them. All right. I'm being very blunt here. This is a big problem. I'll tell you right now. The big problem with Congress pursuing this is that they don't yet have a consensus understanding of the fact that all these operations are criminal and illegal. When they get to that point, then their strategy will change. Good news is our private legal team, which are very powerful attorneys, and the United States law enforcement and military people, I call them the white hats, good guys who are actually on the side of the law and on the right side of the angels. They do understand that. They totally understand it. So they're a light year ahead of the members of Congress. Not a good thing, in my opinion. There's a gap. We're trying to close that gap. But, as many of you know, the last 3.5 months I've been laid up with a bad accident. I almost got killed in October, and had open fractures with my bones sticking out of my legs and shoulder torn and abdomen torn open and all this stuff. So I've had 4 operations. So I haven't been able to be in DC as much or at all, actually, since I got out of the hospital there at the end of October. But we're doing it remotely. But I'm getting to the point now I can travel again.